Osama bin Laden's 1996 declaration of war against the United States was titled Declaration of War Against the Americans Occupying the Land of the Two Holy Places. A typically awkward and hard to remember title, right? Not just because of how florid classical Arabic can sound when it's translated to English, but also because Osama bin Laden had such a bee in his bonnet about where he was from. When he says the land of the two holy places, what he's talking about is Saudi Arabia. But he won't say that because he's so offended that Saudi Arabia would let there be U.S. troops stationed there that he won't say the name of his home country. He won't say Saudi Arabia. Is that a petulant and childish tactic? Yes. So was renaming French fries. But that's, folks, that's the kind of thing people do. But when Osama bin Laden declared war on the United States, again, his stated reason for doing so was American troops in Saudi Arabia. After 9/11, the George W. Bush administration did, in fact, pull U.S. troops out of Saudi Arabia. But by then, of course, the U.S. had already put troops into two other Muslim countries, our wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. So then those wars, as well as U.S. support for Israel, became the new things that bin Laden and al-Qaeda harped on in their statements about what al-Qaeda was doing and why. They would justify their terrorist tactics with cockamamie pseudo-theology and by saying that terrorist tactics were strategically sound. Quoting bin Laden from 2004, "We are continuing this policy in bleeding America to the point of bankruptcy." He said al-Qaeda found it easy to provoke and bait this administration, talking about the Bush administration in 2004. Quote, "All that we have to do is send two mujahideen to the furthest point east to raise a piece of cloth on which is written al-Qaeda in order to make generals race there to cause America to suffer human, economic, and political losses without their achieving anything of note." Osama bin Laden in his own terms. This is totally central to what they thought they were doing and how they thought they would win. They believed that our generals racing eastward across the globe to put American military forces in Muslim countries, they believed that was their most marketable grievance. Whether it was U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or U.S. wars in Iraq or Afghanistan, resentment of U.S. military presence in Muslim countries was what bin Laden thought earned al-Qaeda the most popular support. Their uninterrupted supply of willing suicide bombers, the continued appeal of their overall al-Qaeda message despite widespread revulsion at al-Qaeda tactics. That's how they thought they would win. They would channel Muslim pride into hatred of the U.S., into uncompromising rejection of all things U.S., rejection of democracy itself as a Western construct, and they would get Muslim countries to institute strict religious rule instead. That was their big idea. That's how they planned to win. They did not win. They did not win. They did not win. The Muslim world is rising up against their lousy U.S. allied despotic rulers, but they are rising up for democracy, not against it. The death of bin Laden is generating just about no reaction in the Middle East. The founder and the worldwide symbol of al-Qaeda was its founder, Osama bin Laden. The source of al-Qaeda's power was him, his vision, his money, his organizational prowess, his status, his visibility. He was key to al-Qaeda's strength. But the other source of their strength was what they believed was the appeal of the al-Qaeda core message. That Muslim self-determination, U.S. stop humiliating Muslims, U.S. out of the Middle East message. One source of al-Qaeda's strength is dead now. Bin Laden is dead. Is that enough to kill al-Qaeda? What about their message now? What about what they always believed was the other great source of their strength? Joining us now is Malcolm Nance, retired naval intelligence officer, former master instructor and chief of training at the Navy's Survival, Evasion, Resistance and Escape School, the SEER School. He's fluent in Arabic. He's now a consultant on counterterrorism and terrorism intelligence for the U.S. government. He's also author of the book An End to Al-Qaeda, Destroying bin Laden's Jihad and Restoring America's Honor. Malcolm, thank you very much for coming back on the show.
Good to see you again, Rachel.
Since we talked on Tuesday night, I have not been able to stop thinking about what you said about bin Laden's death being the nail in the coffin of al-Qaeda. You really feel like him dying means that it's over for them. Can you explain why?
Well, it's pretty simple. We are really seeing right now the beginning of the end of the al-Qaeda organization. And a lot of people will say, no, we have the possibility that there's going to be terrorist attacks in the future, that some of their followers on are going to lash out, there's going to be vengeance. All of this is true, but that's not the central core of what we're dealing with. Al-Qaeda organization has lost the heart, the soul, and the charisma of their ideological leader. This is the man who created bin Ladenism. And bin Ladenism is a lot broader, a lot bigger than saying that we want to fight the United States and push them out. This is a man who was trying to invoke a clash of civilizations where he thought that as a mujahideen in Afghanistan, he defeated the Russians and destroyed communism. Now he was going to invoke Islam, to his variation of Islam, to destroy democracy. So with his death, that whole Islam ideological underpinnings has been taken away. But as we've seen over the last few months, it has really been washed away through the Islamic democracy movement that's sprung up throughout the Middle East. And those two things combined spell no future for the Al-Qaeda organization. Will they actually carry out operations? Quite possible. Will they be successful? In some occasions, they might be. But do they have a future in the Muslim world? Not anymore.
In terms of the American relationship to the Arab Spring, to the Muslim democracy movements that we are seeing in so many countries right now, I mean, as you say, nobody really thinks that terrorism is over now. But should the American construct of a war on terrorism, which we came up with after 9/11, should that construct be over now? Would that help further decimate al-Qaeda's popular base of support?
Well, I mean, there's always going to be terrorism. Terrorism is just a hammer in the toolbox of people who have political dissatisfaction and who won't involve themselves in processes which are peaceful. So we're always going to have people that will choose that. Even in this country, we have people that choose that tactic. However, within the entire broad structure of the war on terrorism, well, in fact, the war on terrorism, its central character was Osama bin Laden. And he drove this mime. He was the one who really pushed us into, number one, by engineering an attack that killed 3,000 of our citizens, and then driving us into wars which he wanted. He wanted us to invade Afghanistan. He had no idea that we would gift him with an invasion of Iraq, and that killed 5,000 more of our service members and tens of thousands of Muslims. So with his death, unless someone who is more charismatic than him, who can carry out an attack of a greater magnitude than the 9/11 attack, who can prove that they can take his legacy and carry on his vision of a Salafist, neo-Salafist, new Islamic caliphate that will destroy democracy, this war is essentially starting to break down in all capacity for that group. They are on their way out.
Malcolm, in terms of the continuing threat of al-Qaeda and groups like it and inspired by it, though, we think about figures like Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen. We think about the impact of groups like the al-Qaeda groups in Yemen, places, al-Shabaab in Somalia and other places. When you look at groups like that, also some of the Pakistani groups, is the American orientation toward those groups a war orientation? Is war still the right construct?
Well, you're right. It is a war orientation. But what we've seen recently is that we know that bringing 150,000 men into a country doesn't necessarily stop terrorism. It kills a lot of people, gets a lot of bodies. But that doesn't necessarily stop the ire that it brings out your mere presence. In some places in Afghanistan, it was a lot less dramatic than it was in Iraq, for example, because we had a greater population density. We had, ideological underpinnings of the war were a little shaky. But when you come into it and you bring a broad-based army, as General Petraeus said and as Secretary Gates said, these are no longer the way that we really need to fight this war. The idea of doing an intelligence war and doing a war which had pinpointed systematic special operations strikes which are intelligence-based, raids, pointed assassinations using remote weapon systems. These are the sort of things which have proved far more effective. Now, you can say that 200 or 300 drone strikes on the Pakistani border are effective and it kills some of the leadership of the al-Qaeda organization, but we don't lose soldiers at that point. You put 150,000 ground troops on the ground, and you're going to be not only killing some of the enemy who were out on the battlefield, but you're going to be killing the civilian population. And so we get into that cycle of where the population no longer supports us, or the population is upset with the operations that we're doing. Well, all of these things can be done by just removing the large ground forces and going back to what I believe at one point was the Biden plan, which we like to refer to. I write for Small Wars Journal, which is a defense blog, and we refer to as counterterrorism, which is counterinsurgency and counterterrorism in a hybrid. And that may be the future for the way that we defeat the remnants of what al-Qaeda was.
Malcolm, can I ask you just one last question about something you mentioned on Tuesday?
Sure.
You said that you were in Osama bin Laden's compound in Jalalabad after the Tora Bora operation. Can you just tell me the circumstances of? Are you allowed to talk about that? Can you tell me what it was like and how that happened?
Well, I could tell you some of it. I was an intelligence contractor at the time. But I went to the Osama bin Laden residence in Jalalabad. And Jalalabad had a special place for Osama bin Laden. He had residences in other places, in Kandahar and Kabul. But Jalalabad is where he got his combat stripes fighting in the Afghan war. He did a mission fighting the Russian forces at Jalalabad airport. And so he had a very, very large compound out on the south side of Jalalabad, directly on the road. If you go outside his compound and you get on the road, it goes right up to Tora Bora. And it was very much like the compound in Pakistan. It was a large walled structure. It had 5 to 6 buildings inside it. And it was very austere. I was rather surprised and impressed that he could live on a small cot with a Quran stand, some teacups, and pretty much nothing other than that, other than his weapons and his guards and his family. But that was the entire mystique of Osama bin Laden. And after he left the Jalalabad compound, he was last seen on Tora Bora, and he was supposed to be living in caves. But we now see that that's turned out differently.
Yeah, it turned out to be a really, really nice cave. Malcolm Nance, retired Naval Intelligence Officer, former Chief of Training at the Navy's SEER School, as well as author of the book An End to Al-Qaeda, Destroying Bin Laden's Jihad and Restoring America's Honor. Malcolm, thank you so much for coming back on the show. Really appreciate it, man.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you. So Osama bin Laden winds up in a big house in a big city in Pakistan, a $2 cab ride from Pakistan's equivalent of West Point. Suspicious is the nicest thing you can say about that. So is it true, as we hear from Washington, that the U.S. relationship with the Pakistani government is pretty much unchanged since the news of Sunday night? Like doormen and potted plants, the answer to this question can only be found in the lobby. Steve Clemons joins us next.